This week, we are going to explore the question of what impact does the family have on delinquency. In prior chapters, we learned that certain individual traits increase the likelihood of delinquency, especially high rate chronic delinquency. Delinquency is also caused by the individual's social environment. Individuals in certain types of environments are more likely to engage in delinquency for reasons that were explained by strain, social learning, control, and labeling theories. These environments have a relatively large effect on individuals who possess traits conducive to delinquency, but also lead many normal individuals to engage in delinquency. This chapter, we examine the effect of the social environment on delinquency. In particular, we ask what types of families increase the likelihood of delinquency. All major delinquency theories argue that the family plays a central role in determining whether juveniles engage in delinquency. The family, perhaps more than any other social group, influences 1, a juvenile's level of or reaction to strain. 2, whether the juvenile learns to conform or deviate. 3, the control to which the juvenile is subject to, and 4, the extent to which the juvenile is subject to labeling. The family sometimes has a direct effect on delinquency, and it sometimes has an indirect effect through its influence on such things as juveniles' individual traits, school performance, and selection of friends. What does the research say about the influence of the family? Are family factors a major cause of delinquency? You've already been exposed to the family research in previous chapters where we discussed the evidence on strain, social learning, the control theories, and labeling theories. So portions of what the following discussion, will sound very familiar. So let's, without further ado, jump right in. The changing American family, right? It's not the same as it was decades ago. The American family is changing and has done so rapidly over the last few decades. So our traditional family, intact family, is a thing of the past. Why? We have changing sex roles. They have created a family where women play a greater role in the economic process. Egalitarian family structure is what it's referred to. Fathers are now spending more time with children than they did 20 years ago, and mothers are spending less time with children than they did 20 years ago. Does the mother's employment outside the home increase delinquency? Mothers spending less time out of the home now than years ago. Years ago, they assumed the major responsibility for children and their care. In 1950, only 16% of mothers worked outside the home. Now 75% of mothers work outside the home. Criminologists have asked whether the mother's employment outside the home increases delinquency. I'll note that they've never asked whether the father's employment outside the home increases delinquency. It has been argued that the mother's employment outside the home may increase the likelihood of delinquency for several reasons. Among other things, it may reduce maternal supervision of the child and weaken the emotional bond between the mother and the child. Data, however, suggests that mother's employment outside of the home has little effect on these factors, and there is little or no relationship between delinquency and the number of hours worked by the mother. Family makeup. After a decades-long decline, 68% of underage minors now live in two-parent families. It's 27% live with one parent, and 5% live with no parents, meaning they live with other relatives like grandparents or somebody else, aunt and uncle. There are significant racial differences in the family makeup that still exist. They are all outlined in the book, and they are all outlined here. I'm not going to read through them, but as you can see, there are significant racial differences, and I have a chart coming up. Teen moms, single moms, teenage mothers are still a cause for concern. Today, more than 90% of teens who give birth are unmarried. Living in a single parent home, especially one headed by a unmarried teenage mother, has been long associated with difficulties for both the mother and the child. kids born into single-parent homes are more likely to live in poverty and to experience long-term physical and social difficulties. A study compared mothers who gave birth at age 17 and under to mothers who had their first birth at ages 20 or 21, which is still 2 to 3 years younger than the average age for a first birth. Even after background factors like race, ethnicity, and class were controlled, it was found that the teenage mothers obtained less education, had larger families, were more likely to obtain welfare or public assistance. Further, the children of these teenage mothers were more likely to, one, be born prematurely, and to be a low birth rate, which increases the likelihood that they will develop traits like irritability and low self-control. Number 2, be physically abused, neglected, or abandoned. 3, be poorly supervised. 4, have trouble in school. And 5, become teenage mothers themselves. Given the findings, one might expect that the children of teenage mother would be more delinquent, which the data does suggest is the case, but the effect of teenage motherhood on delinquency is moderate in size. But today, there are fewer teenage moms in the population today due to things like birth control and the legalization of abortion. All right, I should have popped this chart in before the last slide, but this is where it got stuck. Living conditions of children by race. As you can see, it shows the percentage of children who are living with 2 parents, or just a mother, or just a father, or living with no parents, again, meaning not living on their own, but living like with grandparents or another relative. Childcare. Does placing juveniles in childcare facilities increase the likelihood of delinquency? 49% of children between the ages of not even a year to 4 years with employed moms are cared for by a relative. 24% are cared by a formal daycare or center. 11% are cared for by non-relative in an in-home-based environment, maybe like a next door neighbor or something like that, for an example. A major research project did find that early child care placement has lasting effects on problem behavior, though the effects are very small in size. Specifically, the researchers found that children who had spent a lot of time in care tended to report slightly elevated levels of impulsivity and risk-taking behavior when they became teens. The risk-taking behavior consisted of acts of theft, property damage, and drug and alcohol use. These findings took into account and arranged for other factors such as the parents' socioeconomic status and the quality of their parenting. Children from working poor families are likely to suffer from inadequate child care due to lack of access to affordable, high-quality child care is related to things like family poverty, joblessness, and homelessness, which, as we've learned, are factors that are considered to lead to delinquency. However, high-quality care is not without its own flaws. The effect of child care on problem behavior is reduced when the child care setting has a low child-to-caregiver ratio. That's when caregivers are responsible for supervising a small versus a larger group of children. Overall, there is some indication that extended time in care places children at a slightly higher risk of problem behavior, but it's not very clear as to why that is the case. And then economic stress. We have already talked about poverty in a couple of sections. To recap, poverty in the United States is more prevalent now than it ever has been. And while it affects all ages and genders, race, ethnic groups, it is severest amongst young families, those under 30. The federal poverty level is unrealistic. I've said this before, $24,000 for a family of 4. Nearly 7 million children live in extreme poverty, which means that your families are living on less than $12,000 a year for a family of 4. 45% of American children are considered living in low-income families, minority children more likely than whites to live in poverty. Living in poverty has lifelong effects on children, including cognitive achievements, educational attainment, nutrition, physical and mental health issues, and social behavior. That also affects the parents as well and anybody else who's living in the home. So the majority of families as a whole live in substandard housing without adequate health care, nutrition, or child care. And, as we move forward, the recent political trends are showing that the social quote-unquote safety net is under attack. Those, when the government helps pay and subsidize. And poor families can expect getting less aid in the coming year. Why might that be? Well, our elderly are living longer. It's going to put a strain on health care. There's also social security issues. So the recent economic upheave and unemployment rate, these are all going to cause pressures in the future. So let's switch gears. Talked about the family makeup and the future, where it goes from here, what we might see in trends moving forward. But next, we're going to turn to the family's actual influence on delinquency.